Hey guys, Kinggath here with Bethesda Mod School. In this lesson, I am going to teach you how to nav mesh workshop objects. Now, some of what I show you will be also useful for interiors and world nav meshing, but if you really want to learn that, I would recommend you go check out some of Dark Fox 127's Skyrim tutorials on nav meshing. He does a very, very thorough job of explaining it, and all of that information passes forward to Fallout 4. But one of the unique things with Fallout 4 is nav meshing individual objects because you can place them on the fly in workshop mode. So rather than just the world itself needing a nav mesh, any of your objects that a settler might walk on top of or inside of, it's going to need to be nav meshed. And all a nav mesh is just a series of triangles that tells the settler what is acceptable for them to walk on. So like what are floors essentially. Or what you'll find in part of this, what I'm going to show you, is that Bethesda tends to also do the roofs, which is why we end up with cows and people up on roofs all the time. And I think part of that is actually just to be flexible, because players will often treat roofs as floors in the sense of their building, where they might add walls on top of a roof and add a second floor that way. And so it just, by nav meshing everything, you just give more options to players in that regard. So in this tutorial, I am assuming that you've at least gone through the basics of the CK so that you can navigate the camera, because it's very important to nav meshing. And likely you'll have wanted, if you're going to be doing these workshop items, hopefully you know how to create construction records and your own models, even if it's through the static collection method, through kit bashing. There are tutorials in the CK series of the Bethesda Mod School. We'll teach you all of that, so go back through those if you're not familiar with some of the things I show you. Now, as I had to do in the last episode, and probably or last lesson, and I will in the next 3 or 4, maybe more, is I've got a fresh baby next to me in the evening when I record tutorials. He's by my side, and so if he's making little noises, I'm not going to bother to stop and recut and re-record. Just going to leave those in. My life is very, very busy right now, and I want to keep getting you guys this information, but so there's going to be a little bit of rough edges in that sort of thing. So onto the actual tutorial. So I'm going to show you things in a variety of orders. I'm going to show you a couple of different models to demonstrate how this actually works, and I'm going to talk about a bunch of different tips as we go. So I'm going to start out with a super easy method, and it's going to be one of those things where it'll make more sense what actually happened that you saw after we get further along. But I want to show this method first because it shows something really easy you can do and powerful with the creation kit. And for some people, this might be enough to do the workshop items that they've already done, and then they won't need to worry about the other steps yet until they start building more complex items. So if you have a basic object that's maybe just a floor, for example, say you built a bunch of retextures or material swaps of some of the floor pieces, these are one of the easiest ones to nav mesh. So to start, any object that you want to create a nav mesh for, you simply find its static record, and not just static records can be nav meshed. Certain other ones like activators can be nav meshed as well, though it's a little more rare that you might do that. Most items that you're going to nav mesh are going to be static records, but there are basically anything underworld objects, or almost anything. I won't say anything. I don't think lights can, but most of the things underworld objects can be nav meshed, but mostly you'll be nav meshing your static records. I would say the 2 big exceptions to that would be furniture and activators, because you might have something, for example, plots are activators in some settlements. Those needed to be nav meshed, or something like the artillery for the Minutemen, that is likely nav meshed because the settlers have to be able to walk on it. All right, so let's go ahead and right-click on our object, and you'll see that there's a Nav Mesh Object option. So this is how you start. So you're going to go ahead and hit that, and it will bring up this empty cell, just this empty void with your object in it. Now, this window works a lot like the render window that you're used to in some of the other tutorials I've shown you, but one of the differences is that you can't actually move the object itself. The object is locked in place. You can click off of it, you can deselect it, and once we start building the nav mesh, you can move the pieces of the nav mesh, but you can never move this particular object. Now, you can move the camera around so it looks like the object's moving, and this uses the hotkeys I've shown you in some of those other videos. So if you're not familiar with how I'm doing all this, definitely go back and check the very first creation kit lesson, which will show you how to do all this camera movement. And so you can move around the camera, but the object is technically always in the same spot. So now with these simple objects, these floor pieces, there's no reason for you to get into the nitty-gritty of nav mesh generation, because the CK can do just fine on its own. So what you want to do is make sure the object is selected so it's highlighted green. So to do that, you would hold the Alt key and then left click with your mouse, and it will highlight green. Then you're going to go up to the Nav Mesh drop down here, go to Generation, and then go to Advanced. and then you're going to click Generate Objects. And you'll find that there are suddenly some pinkish purple triangles with some little purple or pink, whatever you want to call that color, dots in the corner. And it's covering up the object perfectly. It goes right up to the edges. If you see that happen, you're basically done. You can account that as being finished, or you could nudge some of these bits around, which I'll show you in the next section of the tutorial. But for now, I just want to show that for a lot of these simple items, things that are just floors or real basic shapes, you'll be able to allow the CK to do the nav mesh for you. And the final step, whenever you're done doing nav mesh, is to finalize. So what finalize will do is basically tell the game this nav mesh is actually ready to be used, and it does all these tests to make sure that the nav mesh is going to work correctly. You can tell whether or not you've remembered to finalize because some of your outer edges will be yellow. And if you see what happens when I click finalize here, they all turn to like a purple color. So if you see that any of the edges that are outward facing on your item that are going to be needed to be crossed by a settler, you're going to want to make sure that those are purple. If you see that they're yellow instead, it means you failed to finalize. So I will talk about some warnings with finalize in a bit, but for these simple objects, that's generally good enough. Alt select your object, click generate objects, and then hit finalize. So if you've got a bunch of floor pieces, maybe you did material swaps on, or roof pieces, and you want to nav mesh them all quickly, this is a great way to do that. Once you're done with that finalize step, you're going to close this nav mesh toolbar, and the object will disappear from here, and that's how you know you're absolutely done and you're ready to go test in game. Now, one thing I will say, when you want to test, if you want to be very thorough with your testing on nav meshing and you want to make sure that it's actually working correctly, the best way to do that is to at least temporarily add snap points to your object. And that was actually covered excuse me, in the last lesson in the NifScope 101 tutorial. So if you need to know how to add snap points for full testing, that's the best way to do it. Because what you'll find, especially with floor pieces, is that when you place them on the ground, even before you nav mesh them, there's a chance that settlers will be able to path over them because they'll just detect the nav mesh on the ground from the world itself, because a lot of your floors will end up pretty flush. So the best way to confirm that your nav mesh is actually working correctly is to build your object up in the air and then build stairways to it. And the only way to build stairways in a way that you can be certain that your settlers will be able to actually path, because pathing, once you start connecting objects, can get weird, is with snap points. So snap points are a great way to make sure that your nav meshes on all your different objects line up together, which is pretty important to make sure that the settlers can generate a path around if you wanted to path them around. So at the end of the tutorial, I'll probably hop into game and show you, in case you don't know, how to force your settlers to move around and how you can set up like a basic little demonstration for yourself to prove that your nav mesh is working before you ship out your mod out the door. So the next thing I'm going to show you is how to nav mesh the inside of a building. And I'm going to do two demonstrations of this, one for a real basic one and one for a more complex one. So we're going to go ahead and take this outhouse double I built for this tutorial. It's basically our trusty old outhouse from a lot of these other tutorials, but I doubled it up and made it its own little bathroom type building. So we're going to go ahead and hit Nav Mesh Object here, and you'll see that I have a second copy called Demo. That was just me running through and doing a demo privately real quick to make sure I had the process down before I showed it to you guys. All right, so just like that flat item, you'll see that you come in and the object is there. It is highlighted. Now with this, I mentioned earlier that you can nav mesh the roof. I'm not going to bother for this particular tutorial, but I will say it is okay. So you might hear a rule if you start searching the internet for tutorials on nav meshing that you can't have nav mesh islands. You can't have chunks of nav mesh off by themselves. Everything has to be connected. That is not actually the case for workshop objects. You can actually have little individual chunks of nav mesh, and that is okay, though it's not ideal. You want to limit it as much as possible. So doing things like having the roof in one set of nav mesh and the floor in another makes sense, but you don't want to have little tiny pockets, and all that will make a little more sense after I show you how to do this. So at the core of nav meshing, you're just basically laying down triangles on the floor so that settlers and AI in general can design themselves a path to get around the world. So you're basically teaching them what is floor and what is acceptable to walk on and what shouldn't they walk on. So you don't want them walking through walls. You don't want them standing on tables. So you're basically teaching them what things that they should be able to walk on are. And to do that, we essentially just draw triangles, but we're not drawing it by dragging and dropping. Instead, we draw with vertices. So if you're familiar with 3D modeling at all, this should be no problem. If not, it might take a little getting used to. And I will say, when you start out nav meshing, it can be frustrating. And a lot of people will tell you they absolutely hate nav meshing because it's frustrating at the beginning, but once you get past that beginning point and it clicks for you, I actually find it enjoyable because it's kind of like puzzle solving. It's kind of like you're solving a little visual puzzle. So if you're into that at all, you will probably find enjoyment in nav meshing once you get past it. If puzzle solving is not something you would ever find fun, this is probably going to annoy the hell out of you, but it is a necessary evil if you want to build workshop objects. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to just pick a corner to start in, and we're going to right click. And that is going to create this little green square here. And that's one of our vertices. That's going to be the basis of designing our triangles. And so basically anywhere you right click, you can create one of these little dots here. But what I'm going to tell you, I'm going to show you the quickest way to do things right from the get-go so that you don't have to waste a lot of time that other people might teach you a different way. So what I recommend you do is after you place your first dot, hold down the control key and then place your second dot. And what you'll see is that both of those stay green. And that means that the next time you do this, you're going to have 3 points. They will all be selected because you're holding control. And anytime anytime you're in this nav mesh mode, detects that, it will automatically create a triangle for you so you don't have to do it manually. I'll also show you how to create triangles manually because there are times when you have to do that. But in this case, I want to show you the quickest method possible. So we've got those 2 green, which means they're selected because I was holding control. So we're going to continue to hold control. We're going to right click over here and it instantly generates a triangle for us. The other thing it does is it then highlights 2 of the points, thinking that the next thing we're going to want to do is create another point while holding control to create yet another triangle. And this is one of the things I find kind of therapeutic about this. I love the way they did this. It's very easy for me to work, and I can actually nav mesh very, very quickly because I understand all the concepts now. And you can get to that point too. And I will probably show you a speed nav meshing later on in this just to show you how quickly you can actually do this. But for now, I want to go slow just so you guys can follow along with me. So one thing in this case you'll see is that it selected the 2 over by the toilet where I don't actually need the settler to walk. And so why I know that, let's talk about that. So in general, anything narrower than a doorway, you don't really need to nav mesh. It's very unlikely the settlers will ever be able to get to that point. So unless you have a very specific reason for it, for perhaps you have some sort of furniture marker that's going to end up there that you know that they're going to need to be able to path to, it's unlikely they're ever going to be able to path there otherwise. And so you could do it. You could try nav meshing into those tight corners just for the sake of being thorough and maybe to try and force something to work. But if it's narrower in this doorway, you probably don't need to worry about nav meshing it. And so I didn't bother to go to this corner, and I'm not going to. You also don't want to nav mesh over top of objects you don't want the settlers to walk through, because even though, for example, if I were to, and I'm going to go ahead and do this and we can delete these afterward. If I go ahead and nav mesh like that, the settler doesn't know that this toilet's here, so it's just going to try and follow these triangles that we gave it. And so it could try and walk right into the toilet, but the game won't let it because of the collision on the toilet. And then what could end up happening is that the settler may have created itself a path that's invalid, and they'll just get stuck, and then they'll just kind of stand there. And in worst case scenarios, it's very rare, but in worst case scenarios, if you create enough paths via bad nav meshing like this, where the settler can get stuck over and over again, you can end up with an infinite loop where they just continually create themselves bad paths and it crashes the game. So it's rare. It's more common in world building when you're doing nav mesh. So you'll see a lot of people who nav meshed for games like Skyrim be very, very terrified of messing with nav meshing because it used to be way more dangerous. It's a little harder to break the game now. I think they've improved on the code a lot for Fallout 4. But in these objects, it can definitely happen. But in general, I would just use the doorway as your measuring stick of just nav mesh anything that's that wide or wider. So we're going to go ahead and show you a couple more things you can do here. So one is you can select triangles directly and they turn green. You can also select edges, although they're a little harder to see. But we're going to click this triangle and we're going to just push the delete key on our keyboard. So that's how we can get rid of ones that we determined that we don't need. Another thing you can do is you can click on any dot to select it, and it will deselect everything else because I wasn't holding any hotkeys. Now, if I hold control, I can once again select this. And now, as you guessed, you're now in position to once again hold control, right click again, and get an instant triangle again. So we're going to go ahead and do that. So one of the things we have to look out for here is that we don't want to set up a scenario where the settlers are trying to walk through this wall. So we're going to actually kind of walk our triangles around it. So we're going to control and right click here, and that created another triangle. And you can always mouse over to see where all your triangles are. Now, one of the things I'm going to show you right here, this triangle that you see here, this guy, is on the borderline of being unusable. So if you ever find that your nav mesh seems to not work, it might be because the triangles you created are too narrow. So you generally want to try and make big, giant, fat ones. Those end up being real easy for the settlers to path. So I'm fairly certain this one will work, but if you ever find that for some reason they won't cross some arbitrary boundary, it could just be that you made a long, skinny triangle. And the way to deal with that generally is you can add additional triangles in to break them up. So we could right click anywhere along one of these edges, and you can see that it will work because our two things will happen. First of all, the edge itself will be highlighted, and then you'll see that a plus sign appears next to the cursor. So we could right click here, and then you'll see that it added a new dot in there, and if you start mousing over, you'll see it fractured all of this into different things, and then we can move this around. And now we've got some fatter triangles that the game tends to like a little better. So that's something you can do if you find that the NPCs are getting stuck at different points. All right, so now let's get back to our nav meshing. So here's a point where there are different takes on how you do it. I like to do it one way. I'm going to show you that, but I'm also going to show you a way other people like to do it. So the way I like to do it is when I know I'm going to have to nav mesh into weird crevices, I'll just look at the first edge I can go to where I'll still have access to where those other crevices I'm going to have to nav mesh are to. And one of the things you always have to nav mesh to is through doorways. Anytime you see a doorway, if you don't nav mesh through there, the settlers will never ever path through that door. So that's really important. And so I know that I'm going to have to build all of these triangles in a way that they're going to get access to this door. So I'm going to go ahead and just build to this corner. Whereas other people, what they'll do is they'll go to this corner instead, down on the left-hand side, and then just add in those extra dots here along the doorway. And both methods are totally valid. So it's whatever feels most comfortable to you. The only thing that you have to worry about, I'd say there's two key things you have to worry about. One is never cross the streams. And by that I mean don't create a situation where two edges cross each other. And I'll show you what that might look like. So if we go ahead and build ourselves, and I click where I said I was going to do, and right click here and create this triangle. And then let's say we wanted to go over to this corner here, but I decided to select this guy, and then do it. What you'll end up seeing happening here is that we have two triangles now, and I got to get the camera in a better position, that are overlapping. So we've got this guy and this guy. Actually, we've got 3 or 4 triangles that are actually overlapping because there's a whole bunch of them overlapping underneath this new one we created. This will create a corrupt nav mesh, and likely what will happen when you get to the finalize step, it'll just erase all of your nav mesh. So it's very, very important that you pay attention to which edges or which points you're grabbing when you're creating new vertices and new triangles. So you're going to want to just be careful. And the nice thing is that it's very easy to tell most of the time that you have done that because it will be highlighted with this darker red. So you can see that there's this kind of flickering going on, this like darker red color. So I'm going to just go ahead and click this guy and press delete so to get rid of it. And now we can see we've got the nice smooth pinkish light red color going on again. So don't cross the streams. That's one thing. And the other is anywhere you want the settlers to be able to path from triangle to triangle need to be one whole shape. So it needs to be continuous. If, for example, we did something like this, we click right here, and then we click here, and then we go ahead and create another triangle here, and we leave this gap in here for some reason, the settlers will never be able to path from this triangle to this triangle. They will just treat this as if it's not floor. They'll treat it like lava, basically. They'll never be able to go between there. So you got to watch out for that. You don't want to create any gaps like that. But I did mention that you can create things like you can do a whole different set of nav mesh up on the roof. That's totally allowed. Whereas you'll often hear that you shouldn't do that anywhere else. You shouldn't leave. That would be considered an island because the roof nav mesh would be completely separate from this. It is allowed with these workshop items. But this right here, this is bad. And so if you find yourself actually having done that by mistake, I don't know what hotkey I keep hitting. I think I'm double tapping shift or something to zoom my camera out. But if you find that you do something like this, you leave a gap by mistake, and I'm going to go ahead and push this over here. What you can do is you can click on one of those vertices, then click another, and then click a third. Once you have 3 vertices selected, if you press the A on your keyboard, you will create a triangle between those 3. And then you're back into the shape you were before, where just one edge is selected so that you can start, once again, Control and right click to create more triangles. So if you accidentally leave yourself a gap, you can just grab the 3 vertices surrounding that gap, and you can press A to generate a new one. And what you just saw, what I was doing there, you can actually click on any of these points, and if you mouse over them, you'll see that your cursor becomes the 4-way move arrow, and so you can use that. You can actually just drag these around. Now it tends to drag them relative to your camera, so you got to kind of be careful with that. You might want to zoom your camera around with the shift key and look around and make sure that everything is kind of laying out nicely. And if you need to go up and down, if you need to make something vertical, you can hold the letter Z and then drag, and you'll definitely be locked to the Z axis, so it always moves where you want it to. And that tends to be very, very useful with stairs, which I'll cover in the more advanced model I'm going to show you after this. So let's go ahead and finish this guy off. So we need to flush into this corner. Whoops, I zoomed out way too far there. And then we want to do this. So here we're going to run into a little issue, and so I'm going to slow down a second here. So right now, what we don't want to end up with a situation of is settlers trying to path through this wall. We want to make sure that they can go around it. So this is where one of those cases where adding in an extra thing will be handy, but you also need to make sure that you give a wide enough berth around the object that the settlers don't just get stuck on it. So I'm going to leave a little bit of a gap around that object to make sure that they don't just get hooked on it. And we're going to go ahead and right click right here to create this little nice square edge. And then we're going to take this guy and move it up a little bit. And click here and right click right to there. And there we go. Now they should be able to walk right up. Now, my decision to not go in the corners, I already explained, but the decision to go right up to the edge of the toilet like that has to do with furniture markers. So if you followed along all of my tutorials and you did the outhouse store that we did, which I believe I have in this plugin, so I can show you. So let's go to our furniture and go to outhouse. You'll find that the furniture objects have these little circles, these little teal circles on them. And as long as those teal circles are on the nav mesh somewhere, the settler will be able to animate to it. So even though technically they might be, if they were sitting on our toilet, they might be past our nav mesh, because our teal circles will end up lining up on this area of the nav mesh, that's how I know it was far enough. So that's kind of how you decide where you're going to go when you're dealing with objects, especially ones you know that the settlers are going to have to interact with. So now before we move on from this object, like I said, I'm not going to do the roof here, but I will show you what I mean by the island thing. We'll just do a quick single triangle. So this is totally allowed. This is its own separate nav mesh area that the settlers might be able to walk on, and that's okay. So I just want to show you that real quick. But one thing I'm going to talk about here is this doorway. So the doorways can be tricky, and this might be one of those things where you run into problems when you're actually testing, where it just doesn't seem to work. They won't pass this threshold. So there's 2 potential ways to resolve that. So the most common way for objects is to just make sure you're cutting through what's called the nav cut. And nav cut is very complicated. It's something I'm going to go into in depth because I've got a lot of tricks for dealing with it, and that'll be its own tutorial at some future point. And I'm even going to eventually show 3D Max users how to create their own nav cuts, because that's very, very useful. But the way to check if there's a nav cut involved in your model is you're going to make sure your mouse is inside of this window, inside the render window. Then you're going to press the F4 key on your keyboard. And you'll see that these boxes start appearing on everything. And most items, the boxes are red. Occasionally, they can be other colors like blue or white. And different color boxes are different types of collision. So in this case, the red ones are static collision. Those are just plain Jane. The item's never going to move, and no matter what you do to it. And that is the most common collision you'll see. And then in this particular object, you also have a black outline collision, and that is a nav cut. That is essentially what a nav cut is it says to the game world, hey, if you find me intersecting with your nav mesh, ignore your nav mesh and use the nav mesh that I have in that space instead. And so it's very important that your nav mesh, if you find any of these nav cuts, goes through to the edge and out just a little tiny bit, just a fraction of an inch outside of that nav cut. So you need to, so pressing F4 lets you see that, so you can confirm indeed that you have gone through that box. Now, occasionally that is not enough either. Occasionally you need to go even further than that. You need to use, instead of the collision, you actually have to use the object bounds. And to see the object bounds, you alt click an item, and you'll see that there's these red, green, and blue lines, and that represents the object bounds. And so sometimes you need to pierce out of that. So now if we were to try and do that, you're going to find you run into a little issue here. So if we grab these two and then we know, okay, our object bounds are here. Well, first of all, you can't keep vertices selected and then do this after the fact. So you need to make sure that you have the object selected before you start selecting the vertices. That was a mistake I just made. But if you then come over here and like, okay, I'm just going to control click over here, it doesn't actually work. You can't actually create triangles out into the void. So you have to do a little trick. So what you would want to do is you're going to take your little objects in the doorway here, and you're going to back them up a little bit, and you're going to go ahead and create yourself 2 more little triangles here. And then you're going to grab all 4 of these. Oops, we don't want to grab the triangles. We just want our vertices. And then you can just drag them. So you can just drag and drop those. And now you'll see that our 2 are kind of floating out into space. And we're going to once again Alt select that first. And now what we can do is we can drag these guys till they're right to the edge of the box. Now this is particularly useful for spawned objects, so script spawned objects. And if you don't know what that means, think things like sim settlements, how the plot will generate objects on the fly after the fact, or like the transfer settlements city plans. These are transfer settlements blueprints. That's another way where the objects kind of appear in the game without you actually having to build them yourself. Those are methods where this often is more useful. And I don't know why that is. Some quirk with the engine, but sim settlement designers in particular, this is a very useful tactic to do. We call these Navmesh Tongues. I don't know if that's an official term that Bethesda uses, but that's what we tend to call them on the sim settlements team. Is you build these Navmesh Tongues to make sure that you're piercing through the object bounds. And one of the reasons that we did this little extra where we did basically created 2 of these little rectangles here, because you didn't actually need to, we could have easily dragged these out here, is that when we do it this way, where we have a second set, we can actually then take these and make them wider. So we can actually go over to the edges, and then we just give these settlers a much wider area where they can potentially enter. So then we go ahead and make sure that this is all the way to those corners and out to the edges and outside of that bounding box. And so now the settler can try and enter our nav mesh from anywhere along this rather than just that narrow flat little piece. So then, for example, if something ends up blocking this space, which obviously that wouldn't be good because there's a doorway there, but you just give a bigger opportunity for the settlers to path. Because effectively, the way nav mesh works on individual objects is once this object exists in the world, it's going to try and take these triangles and merge them with all of the triangles on other built objects that are nearby and the game world ones, so the ones that are default. And it's going to try and basically take all of that and recalculate it and design itself a new one. And so anywhere you can create these potential areas for connection just makes it easier for the game engine to calculate and make sure that your nav mesh is brought in line with the world and easy for settlers to find themselves a path to get in and around it. So now we're at the point where I would call this done, other than our roof. Our roof is terrible. In fact, I'm just going to delete that because we wouldn't nav mesh like that. You'd want to cover the whole thing. In fact, you might even cover the little edge here. And again, the reason for that would be so that players could then, for example, add walls on top of this and just pretend this is a floor, and it just gives them more building options, even though it's not necessary. So we're going to not bother with the roof, but at this stage you would normally go and finalize like I showed you in the other step. But one of the risks there is if you screwed up somewhere, if maybe you're not certain, and I would especially recommend this while you're learning still. So I'm confident this will work, but some of you may not have that same confidence, and even after you gain the confidence, there is another potential where things could go wrong. So what I recommend you do when you're getting started, and anytime you do a bunch of nav mesh work on an object where you don't want to lose all that work, is before you finalize, just close this out and just save your plugin. And that will save your work. And then if during the finalize step determines your nav mesh is corrupted and erases it, you can just reload. You can just exit out of the creation kit and reload your plugin without saving. So you'd exit out, don't save when it asks you to, and then reload it. And then your original nav mesh will still be there. So if we go back in here and hit Nav Mesh Object, you'll see that my unfinalized, which you can tell by the yellow edges, nav mesh is still there. So if something had gone wrong, I'd have been able to roll back and get back to this point. And that's very, very useful, especially when we get into the third model I'm going to show you, which is super complex. It's got multiple floors and stairways, and that type of work, losing that can be really painful. So then we're going to go into our nav mesh generation advanced. I'm fairly certain one of these buttons will also do that, but I don't know which one it is, and I've always been afraid to click it because I'm worried I'm going to accidentally overwrite all of the nav mesh in the game world or something. So if somebody happens to know offhand which one this is, definitely leave it in the comments and we can highlight that comment. But this is where I always go: nav mesh advanced, click finalize. and you'll see that most of it turns purple. Now I say most of it because there's one little edge right here that stayed yellow. Now that edge being yellow is totally okay. Basically what that's saying is that this edge is not going to be crossable, and that makes sense because there is this thing in the way there, and that's okay. We don't actually want our settlers to ever cross that. But if you ever found that some of your edges out here you're expecting to interface with the world weren't purple, that's a big problem. That's not going to be acceptable. You wouldn't, if this edge were yellow, the settlers will never use this. So the finalization is very important. So then we'll go ahead and you can either hit OK or X out of this. We'll hit OK, press X, and there we go. We're all done. So now let's go to the most complicated one. So I'm going to take one of the Sim Settlements houses, one that I know is has a stairway and doorways and all that stuff. So we're going to go ahead and open this up. And I'll show you what's involved in getting a stairway working. So this is one of those cases where things have to be continuous. And in this particular model's case, it gets really tricky because of how tight this is. So in general, you wouldn't want to design your model exactly like this. You would want to make sure there was actually a piece of floor here that the settlers could walk. I've figured out how to make them walk up over this anyway, and I'm going to show you how to do that. But in general, your safest bet is to make sure when you're designing like this that you would leave like a full floor tile at the end, at the top of your staircase, so that they can actually walk up it. So I'm probably not going to nav mesh this entire thing. I'm just going to show you two things. One is how to get around pillars, and two is how to make sure that your stairs, your stair nav mesh is part of the same nav mesh as the floor. Because unlike the roofs where they can be totally separate things, if you want people to actually use the stairs, they need to meld in with the nav mesh of the floor. So we're going to start with nav meshing by the doorway since we already talked about that. So let's go ahead and hit F4 to see our collision. And as you can see, we don't actually have a nav cut in this door. That was a trick I did with some settlements. I deleted a lot of the nav cuts, or I used pieces that didn't involve them just to avoid some of the complexities with nav cuts. Nav cuts are not a bad thing. They're just complex. And when I designed some settlements at first in these first buildings, I didn't fully understand nav cuts. Now I understand them. I'm not afraid of them and actually embrace them. In fact, if you're a long-time or fresh Sim Settlements add-on pack author, you can expect a new tutorial from me on doing better methods for nav meshing and nav cutting, which will help you a lot in time saving. But we're going to go ahead and just start building this out here. So I'm going to I've already shown you most of this, so I'm not going to go super slow in this particular point. I'm just going to get it to the point where I can talk about this pillar thing. So one of the things you can see I'm doing here is I'm working around this pillar. And so you'll end up with a lot of kind of strange points in that regard. You're going to end up with these little tiny triangles around here, and you basically need to, I find the best thing to do is to just get that taken care of. Oops. And I just made a little screw up there. Yep. Okay. I deleted that triangle. So that triangle that I tried to create it manually that was already there. I just didn't see it. Is because this one was kind of in the floor. So we're going to go ahead and control click these, press A. There we go. And if you see that happen where you're sure a triangle should have appeared, it might be that the place you clicked your third vertice was in the floor, and then you just need to grab that, lift it up, and then see if your triangle is there, and if not, then you can grab your 3 and press A. But what we're doing is we're basically walking around the room and making sure that we go around this pillar. And I'm doing it in more of an advanced method where I'm just trying not to waste triangles, because the fewer triangles you have in a nav mesh, the more efficient it is. So it is generally, if you want to get really good at nav meshing and you're a type of person who likes to optimize, the less you use, the better. And so that is something I try and do as often as I can. And this is part of that puzzle solving aspect of things. But you don't absolutely, especially when you're getting started, don't get too hung up on minimizing. Instead, just focus on making sure you get a complete picture here. But as you can see there, what I did is I managed to wrap all the way around the pillar. And the point of that exercise to show you that was that when you want to walk around things, you can't leave gaps if you want the settlers to be able to path all around. Because if you think about it, if they walk into here, if we had left a gap because of the pillar, or if we just nav meshed over the pillar, they could either walk through it, or let's say they went left and we left a gap right here, they wouldn't be able to cross then into this part of the room. So you've got to get clever, like I just did there, to walk around the pillar and make sure that it is hollowed out, that it's not nav meshed itself, but then all the area is around it. So my method of doing that is just something you'll get more comfortable with, about how to do exactly what I just did there. And sometimes watching people nav mesh, and there's a lot, like I said, Dark Fox was a great one that I learned a lot of these tactics from of nav meshing. It'll just take you a little while to like think about how the floor is going to be laid out and how that's going to be relevant. Another little thing to watch out for here is building nav mesh under things the settlers can't path underneath. So in this case, I know one of the things you could do is you could drag an actor in here so you could see the height. I happen to know from experience that there's no way for an actor to path under here. So what I'm going to do in this case is just nav mesh right to here, knowing that they can't cross under the stairway anyway, and then I'll just pick up from there. So we're going to grab right here. We're going to go to the edge of the staircase, and then we'll go right up to the edge of the table. And look, it's very unlikely that they could path back here, but just in case, we'll go ahead and add another. We'll right click there to add another guy, and then we'll build that triangle. And control right click there, and one more. So then they can, if we wanted to put an animation marker here of them looking at their shelf or something, we could do that. All right, so that's our first floor. It's all done. We might need to, in testing, if we, you might need to do a tongue here to get them all the way out here. But I would say your best bet is to start without the tongue and then test it in game. And if you find there's trouble, then go ahead and add it in. All right, now let's talk about the stairs. So you'll notice that I intentionally made sure to leave this square edge right up against the staircase. So what you're going to want to do with this is generally you can go for these types of staircases, you could probably get away with going all the way to the top. But what I find is best is just do squares. That seems to be safe. So you don't actually have to nav mesh each of these stairs individually. And I'll show you why. So if we press F4 again to get the collision, and I don't know if I was actually highlighted in here or not. There goes collision. If you look at a certain angle, you'll see that there's actually this white box over the stairs. And it's a little hard to see. There is a hotkey for changing everything to wireframe. I find it very confusing to look at, so I've never memorized the hotkey because I don't like it. But whenever you see that white, that is a collision type called Stair Helper. And basically what it does is it allows the NPC to shortcut their way up and not have to worry about these individual stairs, and instead they can just walk right up that white plane. And so because we see that this white plane is all solid, it's just two triangles, we could technically copy that. We could do that same thing because Bethesda's already determined that works. But what I'm going to do instead is do squares. This is what I recommend safe on stairs, is just try and create things that are approximately the size of a square. So you can see like the edge, our edge here is the same, approximately the same. It doesn't have to be perfect. Approximately the same distances to there. And then we just kind of keep clawing our way slowly up the stairs, but you don't actually have to sit there and nav mesh each of these individual stairs. You're just kind of walking up the entire object, and then we'll skip the square thing and just go right up to the top here. And then I'm gonna do it a little wonky because I'm gonna show you the trick for making them walk up real tight angles like I've got here. But as you can see, the triangles trace the shape. And if you ever find that they do something real weird, you probably just clicked a little off. You didn't get on the surface. It's pretty good about detecting where you click, but if you find that the triangle ends up totally weird, you can either grab some of these vertices and try moving them around, or you can click the triangle, delete it, and try again. So the reason I left this guy in a weird spot instead of putting it all the way to the top is one of the ways I found I can get them to walk up here is I just leave this on kind of an angle, and I'll hold the Z key and lift it up. And so technically this is floating quite a bit above the model. They tend to still be able to use that. And then that opens up the opportunity for me to do this, where I've got just enough of a path here where I can create a potential for them to walk up. And I might have to slowly keep nudging this. And this is one of those ones with trial and error, where you would just keep trying, but you can eventually get them to path in a little tight space like that. But what you'll find that when you're testing this is, moving this too far, like if I were to just move this way over here, then all of a sudden the staircase would break. So you got to just keep testing. This is a trial and error to do weird things. And this is why I recommend when you're designing buildings, don't get this tight. Instead, leave the full door width size floor tile at the top of your staircases, and you won't have any problems. And then you would just continue from here. So now we've got, and I happen to know in this building I've got a big bed here, so I'm only going to nav mesh accordingly. You would then continue. So this is all one continuous nav mesh, and we do that because we want them to be able to run smoothly through. Technically, you could just nav mesh this upper floor completely independently and ignore the staircase, but then the settlers would never be able to walk up the stairs and into it. They would only be able to access from some second floor access. So just like the roof we talked about before, if you have a nav mesh island, it can only connect with things out in the world. It can't connect with the structure itself. If you want them to walk within your entire structure, all of it needs to be connected nicely like this. So a lot of these little things, you'll just learn by watching other people do this. So like I said, check out the Dark Fox tutorials, or just search for Navmesh in general. Just search for Navmesh tutorials. The process is similar for most of Bethesda's games, as far as I know. So you should be able to find people doing it in various forms, and people who have come up with their own little tactics and stuff for covering spaces in different games. But all of it, just watching people do it will give you ideas of how you can lay out your triangles to maximize the space effectively and to minimize the amount of triangles you're creating. But like I said, when you're getting started, I would focus on just make sure, if you have to do little tiny triangles, so be it. Just to make sure that you're covering all the space, you're not overlapping anything, and just do it that way. So we actually did most of the building. Like, I don't think I'm I'm not even gonna bother trying to make the settlers walk here, because I know this gun will block their pathing with its collision. So I would call this done, and I would say this is good enough to ship as is. Well, at least ready to go test. And so then we'll go ahead. In this case, this is one of those ones where it was complicated enough. I would absolutely close out and save. Even though I'm fairly confident in my ability to nav mesh objects now, I still would not risk that one. Occasionally, oops, and I just did the wrong object. Occasionally, you will think that you are good, and then the creation kit will prove you wrong and cost you a lot of time. And one of the points that it can really get you on are when you're doing slopes, because if you do a slope over a certain angle, it counts it as an invalid nav mesh. It can wipe the whole thing out. And so I believe it's 45 degrees. If you go anything steeper than that, it wipes out those triangles. So it's possible that my little triangle right here, this guy, might get wiped out. So, and that's where you've got to just keep testing with trial and error. So we'll go ahead and generate, advanced, finalize, and then you just kind of poke your head in and see if all your triangles are still there. And yeah, see, it wiped out that. It was probably too harsh an angle. So I'll have to just keep trying. I'll have to just keep nudging it in different directions. I got this to work in the live version, but it's again, I don't recommend doing this. I don't recommend designing this tight, but you're definitely going to want to go inspect, especially in a complicated building like this. Use your mouse and look around and make sure that it didn't wipe out any triangles, because this is another thing the Finalize can do. It won't necessarily always eat everything. Sometimes it'll just try and fix it. It'll be like, all right, well, I found these 2 triangles that won't work, so I just erased them for you. Unfortunately, it doesn't tell you that. It might tell you in the warning box that I told you in the very first tutorial to shrink out of the way. It's possible it does post it there, but I think doing a manual inspection is totally worth it, because otherwise you're just going to be giving yourself hell in game while you're trying to test it out. So speaking of which, let's head in game and I'll show you guys a settler walking into one of these buildings. All right, so we've got our little settler up here. So one of the things you can do in Workshop, if you haven't known this already, you can select a guy, you can just activate him, and then you can actually just press the activation key at various points on the ground wherever your cursor is, and they will try and walk there. So you can actually force a guy to navigate around. So you can actually use settlers as test dummies to make sure that your nav mesh is working. So you just hit that and go. Kind of point at different points. I will say that one of the things I did in this particular video that you should avoid is I'm using a large settlement I built for my Let's Play. I would recommend 2 things when you're picking where you target or where you test your nav mesh. One is don't use a very busy settlement, because the game is limited in the number of people it can control the AI of in a certain area at a given time. So occasionally they might not respond, not because they can't path, but because there's too many other AI commands being issued in the background, and it just doesn't have room for yours. In my case, I have a mod that jacks up the count real high, so I'm able to do it in this save. But I also wouldn't recommend doing it with mods like Scrap Everything enabled, because if your world nav mesh is kind of screwy due to having too many things scrapped, you could get incorrect results. So I would recommend you use a vanilla settlement that's not built in yet. Just build in it and just have spawn settlers if you need to, or to at least take a settlement that has very, very few settlers and that you haven't scrapped anything that you shouldn't outside of vanilla for when you're testing this, because you just want to eliminate as many variables as possible. As you can see, I'm able to walk him in and out of our outhouse. They're able to connect to these stairs because I added a snap point to the front of this outhouse to make sure that the floor would be flush and that the 2 nav mesh points would match up. And we can actually move him within reason. You can move him within a space. Sometimes if you give commands that are too close together, they'll just ignore them, so he might not walk off to the left over there. Oh, there he goes. And so if we had, for example, a furniture marker there, then he'd easily be able to walk to the teal circle and be able to interact and sit down. And so that is how you would test that. So I would recommend you do it without scrapping mods and in settlements with far, far fewer settlers than I have right now. you.